Welcome back to the Acceptable Chess Weekly Roundup, where we take some time to look back and celebrate our successes, lament our mistakes, and learn how to do it better next time. I'm your host, John Harden, here with National Master Andrew Hoy. And Andrew, first things first, how are the standings looking as we are here at the end of round four?
It's looking pretty good. We have a tight finish that we're almost certainly going to get as we run into the end of the tournament. We have a couple rounds left, but at the top, it looks like it's still anybody's tournament. I think there are 7 people still in contention for first overall, and we've certainly had a lot of exciting games. So I think the last 3 rounds should show us some really good fighting chess as the players really try and get everything they possibly can out of the positions.
Wonderful, wonderful. We took some time, looked at these games, and I think we both agreed that there were a number of things that seemed to keep coming up. So what we're going to do first is try and organize our study tonight by looking at a subject we call topics and trends. So there are 3 major topics or themes that we noticed in the games that we're going to try and point out and clarify for everyone who played in this event. The first one is called hypermodern pawn structures, especially with the pawn on g6 and a bishop g7. Then we'll have development of the light squared bishop with another segment we call whose c3 square is this anyway? And we'll follow up these 3 segments, of course, with the inevitable tactics, tactics, tactics. So let's go ahead and get started. Looking at our first game. First, I want to explore this idea of a hypermodern chess opening. So the hypermodern school is one that was started roughly around the end of World War I. One of its main proponents was a guy named Aaron Nimzovich, who wrote a very famous chess book called My System. And Nimzovich's theory was that the center of the board, these 4 squares that are of such critical importance, did not necessarily have to be controlled by being occupied with pawns. Up till that point, people like Siegbert Tarrasch and Wilhelm Steinitz had always coached that occupying the center with pawns was of critical importance in order to maintain control of the game. Nimzovich's idea, you can see somewhat in the execution of our first game, which is Chip Rutan versus Tyler, right? Tyler here is playing pawn to g6 and bishop g7 with the idea of trying to control the center from the sides. Now, this school has a lot of major proponents, and the approach can be very effective. But this game is an illustration of some of its drawbacks, because we can see how the problem is when you neglect the center entirely and don't occupy it with pawns at all, as here we'd see Tyler not making a pawn move until move 6, and even then not going into the center. Sometimes you can just get crushed. Right? These center pawns can be a bit of a snowplow, right? And here we can already see this lethal threat of e5 pinning and winning, as they say, because the knight is completely immobilized.
Yeah, and John,
When
that's a really good point. I think even though Nimzovich, one of the greatest chess players of all time, decided that it was better to stay back from the center and really wait for a better opportunity to attack it, I think we both agree that for anybody starting out, it's much better to start off with the classical openings, e4, e5, and d4, d5. Just put a pawn right in the center, right off the bat, and you really can't get into huge trouble out of the opening if you're putting a pawn into the center on your first move.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's really important to note that what the engine says is okay and what is easy for a human to play are often very far apart.
Yeah,
And
and along those same lines, even if we go back 1 move in this game, I think even here we have a critical moment. The only move that is good for black here is going to be d6 to slow down this e5 push. If black had responded to c4 on move 1 with e5 or c5, then we really don't have to worry about finding the only move that doesn't lose immediately. So I think that just is a really good reason to put a pawn in the middle of the board and don't worry about the rest of the game and the rest of the opening.
absolutely. A very, very excellent point. However, we did see some much more competent use of the hypermodern school and rather expert use, I should say, in our next game, Andrew.
Yeah, and this was a game between Solal and Alex. This started off as a King's Indian type of setup for black. And that's really defined by this dragon structure with d6 and g6. And the bishop comes to g7. And then black actually waits to decide how to break in the center. Now, one key point, this is actually a perk or a Pierz, depending on how correct you want to be with the pronunciation. The difference is whether or not this c4 pawn has moved forward or if it's staying on c2 and we're just developing the knight to c3 right away, which kind of brings us to our second theme of the night. Generally speaking, if you're playing any sort of game with a quick d4, I think that you want to push the c pawn to c3 or c4 before you develop this knight to c3. Do you want to share a couple of your thoughts on that, especially as it relates to people starting out?
Yeah, I think it's worth noting that when you can bring this pawn out, you end up with a lot more ability to pressurize the center. So just taking a quick side trip here and looking at a typical way to begin, right? I talk to my students all the time in a d4, d5 opening, that when you play something like knight to c3, you're really robbing your queenside rook in particular of the opportunity to get play. Because when you play, for example, your c4 followed by knight to c3, you don't just get more pressure on this square, you also more or less guarantee yourself some kind of a half open file or even a fully open file later in the game. Whereas after knight to c3 and black smartly responding with knight to f6, you're finding it difficult to play e4. You've completely cost yourself the ability to play c4, and it's really hard to see where the open files are going to come from.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I think that brings us back to our game. I think we can see how black takes advantage of this knight being on c3 and not being able to push a pawn to c3 later in the game. So let's keep going through the opening. Black makes a typical move in this type of structure by putting the bishop on g4. You do have to be careful that there are no tricks with bishop takes f7 and knight g5 or knight e5 picking off this bishop, but that's a ways away, so we don't have to worry about it. So as we get through here, we kind of get to this normal starting position. Black has a very compact structure. Only two pawns have moved forward, but at the same time, there's nothing for white to do. There are no places for white to attack. No matter how white pushes these center pawns, white's not going to get any advantage, and black's going to wait and see how he wants to develop a center pawn. So at this point, black decides that he wants to continue with e5. c5 would have also been a fine way to continue. And now, after we trade on e5, white is going to try and take advantage of this d file by putting a rook on the d file. And at the same time, black is going to move the queen out of the way and try and show that white doesn't have anything good going on in the center. The d5 square isn't anything special because c6 can happen very quickly and chase away a knight or a bishop from d5. And black is going to wait and put the rooks on the d file and contest that single open file.
Absolutely. It's funny. When I was watching this game, I did think that Salah was going to get better action a few moves later with this bishop to g5 move, and that maybe he could make something happen with the pin. But it turns out in the playing of it that black very wisely puts the pawn on c6, preventing the knight from coming in. Mm-hmm. And white just seems to constantly be one move short of actually being able to make good on his threats.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And we already have reached a critical moment after b4 and we trade on b4. At this point, white has to decide where to put this knight. And white doesn't have any great options for this knight. He can potentially bring it to g3 like he did in the game. But if he does that, the knight doesn't really have a future from g3 either. This g6 pawn is doing a great job of controlling these squares, back to this hyper-modern approach of controlling the squares from a distance. So maybe the best approach for white is actually to bring the knight to e3 or even bring the knight to a4 to try and keep the knight somewhere where it will stay out of the way and avoid any of these problems going forward.
Actually, Andrew, I'm going to interrupt you there. There's a small technical glitch here. We in our examination of this game, I believe that what was played in the game was actually this a4 move, which reduced white's options even more.
Thank you. Yes. So we ended up with this position here. So there's no knight a4 option because of a4 instead of a3. And that was one of the things I that I remember talking about when is it right to play a3 instead of a4, and this might have been an option for when to play that.
Absolutely. I think A3, maybe we have at least some options for the knight that didn't exist before after this same exchange. But after A4, you've robbed yourself of even that much, and the knight has to find a new home.
Yes. So again, I think the way the game continued was perfectly fine. Black is trying to fight against this knight and this bishop. They both don't have great scope. And Black is going to think about how to continue to develop the rooks. And that's really the key point at this moment. Black has to figure out how to finish developing the rooks and contest this control of the d file that White has right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it looks like it, unfortunately, here, Zalal started to worry a little bit too much about his defensive needs rather than trying to continue to advocate for his pieces, because he brings this dark squared bishop back, right, unpinning the knight on f6 and really undeveloping a piece, in my opinion, right, in order to try and trade for this knight c5. But I think that probably wasn't as big a concern as he made it, and he'd be better off just centralizing his rooks and doing his best. As although I think White is worse, he's not anywhere near losing at this point.
I think you're exactly right. And this is kind of the last noteworthy thing that I want to point out here. Even if White continues normal development, something like this, I think that this pawn structure, even with the doubled B pawns, this is still absolutely fine for White. The rooks might switch to the C file at some moment and try and pick off this weak C6 pawn, and this knight is really tied down. This queen can't really go anywhere, and Black's going to have to take some time to untangle with moves like rook d8, trading off all the rooks, and then queen e6 before he can untangle everything.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I think a better way to go than what happened in the game, where Alex was able to consolidate his pieces, get some nice trades, and then ultimately win a very nice victory.
Yes, and we can go very quickly through the rest of the game. After this trade on c5, we eventually had this moment, and White just blundered and allowed this fork on e4, which was a bit of a letdown for the game, considering it was so well played up to there.
Absolutely. I thought very interesting until that point. But it also is worth noting that blunders like that almost always happen when you are already in a difficult position.
Yes, exactly right. And I think that's one of the reasons to play and try and take small advantages, because eventually something good will happen tactically.
Absolutely. Moving forward and looking at trying to get your pieces into good spaces, something else that we had talked about as one of our topics and trends is this development of the light squared bishop. And specifically what I want to go and look into here is this game of Bill Stoltzfus against Cool Ma, Mr. Nick R. Right. After a couple of moves, we reach kind of an unusual French defense move where Bill sallies forth with this move, bishop b5 check. And I want to talk about this for just a minute, as I've seen this move as kind of a theme coming up this week. So one of the things that you want to consider in this French structure, and if you can't remember that much, just think of it as this kind of brigade of light squared pawns on d5, e6, and f7, is that this kind of structure really hurts Black's light squared bishop. Although it's a perfectly legitimate way to play, this is one of Black's positional problems that he really needs to solve. So White is usually better served in structures like this by knight f3, perfectly acceptable, but the sort of mainline way to play is to play d4, occupy, take as much space as possible, right? And then let's say that we do grab as much space even, right? Typically the bishop will come to either d3 or e2, stay in, and later move to attack the king side. Because you can see this light squared bishop is going to be completely shut out of that attack. And if Black decides to castle short, as he so often does, you can create a lot of lethal opportunities that way.
Yeah, and I think that brings up two really good points. The first one and the most important one is that in every single opening, it's important to have a plan. The plan doesn't have to be perfect, but you really need to make sure that you're developing all of your pieces with the same plan in mind. So just throwing out a move like bishop b5 isn't always the best option. It's better to decide that you're going to lock up the center like this, and then with this pawn structure, you really want to attack over on the king side. These pawns are pointing the way towards an attack on the king side, and therefore the bishop really belongs on d3, where it can take a look at this h7 square. Very
Absolutely.
similarly related to that, in most attacks for white, this light square bishop, the king's bishop, becomes a really key piece. And that's because before black castles, the weakest square is this f7 pawn, a light pawn. And after black castles, the weakest square is h7, still a light pawn.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's interesting to note that the game does actually end up going that way. Kulma might have found faster equality here after bishop b5 by playing either bishop d7 and hoping for this wonderful exchange of pieces, because, of course, this is a problem for him, or even just making the bishop look a little bit silly by playing c6 and giving himself some free extra reinforcement in the center. But as it was, black proceeded with knight to c6, which honestly makes a little bit more worth out of this bishop than was probably necessary. And the game proceeded with the light squared bishop getting relegated to the queen side. But eventually, Andrew, we do get this kind of structure that you were talking about, where white has the advantage of space in the center and some possible kingside attacking possibilities, and black is really out in the wilderness trying to search for play.
Yeah, and I think the key moment comes in a couple of moves after we get a little bit of maneuvering and we get to this position. Right now, this bishop is under attack by the knight, if I can draw the arrows correctly, and white really has to decide how to continue this attack. I think the idea that screams at me is to push this f-pawn, and really we want to get this pawn to f5 and break open the structure. These pawns on the light squares are really the only thing holding black's king position together, and we might be able to play a move like bishop c2 and put all of these pieces on this light square diagonal and try and checkmate the king on h7. So to that end, I really like this idea of playing g4 right away. If black does take on h4, well, we've just accomplished two things. We already have this g4 pawn supporting this f5 push, and additionally, we've moved the knight out of the way, so now this f4, f5 idea is ready to go.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that would be a fabulous idea. Notice how instead of doing this by exchanging pieces, we get rid of maybe a defender, but also a really passive and not particularly powerful dark squared bishop. And you can see over the next few turns how suddenly we've got a loose hanging f-pawn, right? Probably not so easy to hang on to. Black's going to pick this off. And white's momentum seems to be very quickly running away from him. Unfortunately, right, it's right around this point that white blundered the knight away and was not able to recover.
Yes, yeah. And Nick went on to win a very clean game after this. So I think the rest of the game, if you're looking at it later on your own, this is a very clinical execution by black of how to win when you're up a piece. White did try and drum up some threats, but black was able to consolidate nicely and close out the game without too much trouble.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking at another victory for black, we had El Shulgin versus Mr. Aaron K at Churchill that ended in a similar fashion.
Yeah, and we started off with the Moscow variation in the Sicilian. Knight c6 is a little bit of a sideline. It's certainly less normal than putting a piece on d7, not the queen, but one of the minor pieces. And we kind of continued from there. So we get to a normal looking position for the Moscow. And this structure is generally an invitation for white to break with d4. The one common idea in Sveshnikov type of positions where you have not played d6 is to actually take back with the d pawn on c6 so that the queen can lend a little bit of extra support to this d4 square to try and slow down this push. So now we get this d4 break, and after a little bit of maneuvering, white breaks open the center. And I think this is a interesting way to try and play for an advantage by white. This is something that is thematic, but I don't believe we've actually had this position in practice. I think this is a new novelty at this point.
Well, not bad for a young tournament.
Exactly, yes. So just to continue going through the game relatively quickly, white moved this queen to try and put some pressure on the light squares, and black took this opportunity to ruin the white pawn structure. With every trade-off, though, there is with every trade, there is a trade-off. So here specifically, we can take back on f3, and even though the structure is ruined on the king side, there is no light square bishop for black anymore. So white is going to have some extra pressure with this diagonal. So moves like bishop e3 and knight d2 and knight c4 can be very attractive. And black still has to move this knight out of the way. Either way, taking on f6 is also fine. And there's really no good way to recapture on f6 because the f3 bishop will hang. So black has to move this bishop away. Black does have the bishop pair and a little bit of pressure on the e-file. And at this moment, I think black finds a really nice tactic to untangle and continue the game with an advantage. So in this position, Aaron found the move castles, which looks like it gives away this bishop. But Aaron had seen a little bit further. He spent a lot of time on this sequence of moves, and he found the brilliant move bishop e6, which attacks the queen, and it sets up a devastating fork on c5, hitting both the rook on e7 and the bishop on c1.
Really kind of incredible play out of black there, I have to say. What about something like sacrificing the exchange here, Andrew, to try and at least get something for your money, maybe a pawn and a piece, and hit here with check? Is that something we can get away with?
It almost is. Unfortunately, this back rank is so weak that we don't have time to do something like that. So black is going to be able to recapture on e6 and consolidate an advantage solely due to this back rank problem and the fact that this bishop on c1 is going to be hanging in just about every variation.
Absolutely. Yeah, I thought a better try for white earlier might be something like, very simply, just knight to c3, bishop to e3, right? Trying to just get his pieces into play. But it's hard to blame Lenny for going for the kill shot with queen to g4. It does look like it's an extremely stressful move to deal with.
I agree, and queen g4 looks really good, and if it's not for this brilliant idea sacrificing the bishop, queen g4 is a clear way to consolidate an advantage. So I think it's very good timing that we are able to find this castles and bishop e6 maneuver to untangle and finish development.
Absolutely.
And
Really
after that
wonderful
move, black did have a material advantage, and black was able to go on quite easily and collect the full point.
Very good. Moving right along, we have another couple of games entered into the whose c3 square is this anyway category. So we had Ted Vogt versus Nate Humphrey, right, with a Caro-Kann opening that went awry pretty quickly for white. In an opening like this, probably one of the more typical ideas is to play something like bishop to d3 to trade off the light squared bishop, because this bishop on the on the b1 h7 diagonal can be quite strong and annoying. But in this game, we see again this idea of bishop to b5 check, which is a little bit strange for this opening, but stranger still is this knight c3 move. So, Andrew, can you talk to me about why this completely natural-looking move is actually a mistake?
Yeah, absolutely. So in this specific position, this knight on c3 is blocking the c2 pawn. The c2 pawn is always going to be eyed by this bishop, and when black finally puts a rook on the c-file, this knight is just going to be in the way. White would really like to play the move c3. We can play c3 here, as a matter of fact, and this supports the d4 pawn. Now, black does have the somewhat typical idea in this structure. This is called the Carlsbad pawn structure of playing b5 and b4, a minority attack to try and give white a backwards pawn on c3. But that takes a really long time, and in the meantime, white's going to have the opportunity to play knight e5, develop the bishop, and try and get some sort of attack going over on the king side. So c3 is a very common move, and one of the key points is that this knight on c3 doesn't really have a future. It doesn't have any good squares from here. This d5 pawn does such a good job of controlling all of these squares, and ironically enough, in a lot of these lines, it would be better to put the knight back on b1 so it can come to the king side this way.
Yeah, that's one virtue that this opening has over the Dutch, that at least it's a bad piece move instead of a pawn move, which of course can't go back.
Yes, exactly.
But, things were not all bad for the white player, because after some initial awkwardness and some maneuvering in the opening, he did end up getting some nice opportunities tactically later in the game. So we can see here that once again, right, this early development of the light squared bishop ends up with it being relegated to a light square pawn prison on the queen side. But after this, right, there is some kind of significant pressure here building up with this pin, and I don't think that this move queen e7 is quite what we wanted to do.
You're exactly right. And after queen e7, white actually has a crushing tactical shot here. So if you want to follow along at home, I'll give you a second to find the shot before John. Are you ready to share the solution with everybody?
1, 2, 3. All right, you can always hit pause.
Not on a stream, maybe on the YouTube video later.
Good point. Good point. Still getting used to this technology myself. Knight d5 is the answer, taking advantage of the, in fact, double pin. Both pieces that seem to be defending the d5 square are inoperable. We can see that this rook on e1 prevents the pawn e6 from making any captures, and likewise with the bishop g5 on the knight. Right. So in the game, white unfortunately missed this shot, but ended up getting very lucky as his pressure did pay off anyway. Knight came into e5, and now I think the best thing for black to do here is probably just play h6. This has a couple of different virtues. Number one, it begs the question of the bishop where he's going. Maybe we can get an exchange that would greatly relieve some of our problems. Already would prevent knight d5 from happening once this knight on f6 is free. But also there's a sneaky idea here, Andrew, that you pointed out to me.
Yeah, and if we continue, so white has all of his pieces attacked, so he really has to continue with a capture. Black obviously cannot recapture with the bishop because the queen would hang, so he has to take with the queen, and now white can take advantage of this and shatter black's pawn structure. At first glance, this looks like it's very strong for white. The king is a little bit loose, but black has a very thematic defense here. Black wants to put his king on h7, and then black is the one who can actually use the g file with the rooks. And with the king on h7, I'm just going to make a random move so that we can continue that way. There's really no good way for white to break in here. Ironically, one of the key points is that we cannot play the bishop to c2 to trade off this great defender, this light square bishop.
This knight. Absolutely. Yeah, this pawn on c3, this bishop comes back, or if we had made the trade to begin with, right, maybe we see a different story out of this position. But right here, the rooks are coming over, easily doubled. We see some crazy pressure starting for black. Would that it were so. Unfortunately, in the game, right, black could not avoid the temptation to take on e5, which actually cannot be done at all. Right? Had he taken with the bishop, it is just as lethal. Now we have this vicious pin scoring a point when with the bishop on g5. But knight takes is just as bad because the pawn just comes in and makes a simple fork.
Yes, and after this, the game really was over. White had an extra piece and a good position to boot. And again, white was able to convert without too much pressure from here.
Absolutely. Andrew, you had mentioned something earlier today about wanting to show something from Nakamura versus Carlsen that was played sometime earlier this morning.
Yeah, so this is a little bit of an interesting moment, but the game this morning, and this was a rapid game between Nakamura and Carlsen in the Magnus Carlsen Chess Tour, they actually reached a similar position with, and they did it through some very modern opening theory, so don't try and follow along at home. But Nakamura played knight c3 and blocked his c-pawn. So knight c3 is definitely a sideline. The main move is c3 here. And again, this pawn structure just makes all the sense in the world. And white is going to have the very standard plan of putting the bishop on d3 and then rerouting the knight to the king side. Nakamura decided that since he is one of the greatest players in the world, he's allowed to break some of these rules. He was going to try and surprise his opponent by playing a sideline, and he played knight c3 instead, with a couple of ideas of some sacrificial ideas, and in some lines he's actually going to try and force black to take on c3 and get the bishop pair for white. Unfortunately, Carlsen responded very well, bishop b4 right away, pinning this knight and really tying it down. And after a couple more moves, this bishop g5 back to c1 is surprising, but he gets a little tiny concession from black. Modern chess is very hard to follow, so we won't try and go too deeply into it. And Carlsen was able to make a draw very easily because of this lousy structure for white. Even though white does have the bishop pair, it wasn't enough to offset this pawn structure, and Carlsen was able to consolidate the draw, and the match was very good for Carlsen at that point. He had an extra white heading into the fourth round.
I think it's pretty obvious that there's only one lesson to take from this, which is that Hikaru Nakamura needs to watch more of our show.
Exactly. Yes.
So these are all very interesting positional themes and higher level stuff. Especially, we saw a game from two world-class players, but it is important as we look at the last few games in our program here, leading up to our feature match, that sometimes the game is just going to come down to simple tactics.
Mm-hmm. So as a 2200 player, I can honestly say I've probably had in my entire chess career maybe 5 games that weren't decided by some sort of tactic. So I think for that reason alone, tactics are the easiest way to improve as a player. It's the first and foremost thing in every single chess game. And I know the rule of thumb is that chess is 99% tactics and calculation. So it's really important to make sure that you're not blundering anything and that you can really take advantage of your opponent's mistakes.
Absolutely. We had a relatively simple material concern come up in this game. Andrew, can you talk to us about this moment when white made the decision to play bishop a3 in answer to this f5 threat to his knight?
Yeah, and I think this is just an example where counting the material is important. The pawn and the rook are 6 points, as are the bishop and the knight. So had black continued this way and then recapturing on f8 with either the bishop or the queen, this looks like it's going to be an equal count in material because the rook and the extra pawn are worth 6, but the 2 pieces are worth 6 as well. However, generally in the middle game, the 2 pieces are worth much more than the rook and the pawn. It's only if white can get to an endgame that he would have an advantage with the rook against the 2 minor pieces. So this is a really good example of why when your opponent gives you a chance to, it's almost always right to trade a rook for 2 minor pieces.
Absolutely. Now black declined that chance, but again, we have an opportunity where luck played a role because white actually offered the same trade again just a few turns later. And this time, black did not refuse.
Yes, and from here, again, black was able to win fairly straightforwardly. The extra dark square bishop really controls the game very, very nicely. And this e5 break here is going to open up both bishops with one move. And that happened a few moves later, and black went on to win a nice game.
Yeah, absolutely. I cannot resist showing the finish because I did think it was a very cute tactic that even took me by surprise. I admit that after a couple more turns here, right, some maneuvering, black makes this seemingly innocent centralization move of knight to d3, but there's actually an incredibly venomous intent here. White already needs to be extremely alert just about this one piece because after rook to h1, there was the game ender of knight to f4. This g-pawn is pinned. I will be eating this queen.
Yes, and that was the end of the game.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking forward, we have another Sicilian as Chris White played Andrew. This game was a little bit messy out of the opening, and I would say the most dominant tactical theme here was just discoveries. Right, something we noted right off the top of this game was this queen g4 move really walked into some potentially lethal threats off the bat. Here, I think you have to notice that the light square bishop is already taking aim, and the very simple e5 would hit the queen while simultaneously making a threat to the f4 bishop, which probably wins the game on the spot.
Yeah, it's certainly an extra piece for for black at this point, and I think that should be enough to win the game. White can still come up with a couple of tricks, but this should be enough to win.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, as it was, right, the game continued, but black was able to make good on a different tactic, which is ye old knight fork, right, on c2, which won him the rook and really put him firmly in the driver's seat. Andrew, moving on, we had another game that had some pretty cool tactics come up. What did you see in in Steve Norton versus John here.
Yeah, and this game was actually played earlier today, so it's a little bit new, but we got to an interesting position. White decided to develop in the hyper-modern style, putting the bishop on b2 to take control of this long diagonal, and black correctly responded quickly by breaking open the center. White decided to attack the queen with bishop c4. This is a good diagonal for the bishop. Again, we talked about how this f7 square is weak until black has the opportunity to castle, so this is a good square for the bishop. White tried to respond with this queen check to try and slow down. Black responded with queen e4 to slow down white's development, and white brought the bishop back to block this check. Now we get to some interesting moments. So here already, this knight c3 is a good move. It takes control of the e4 square so that there are no problems with black pushing e4. And now black played knight d4, which is actually a blunder, and white has a very nice tactic, and he did find it in the game, so this is a nice way to kind of close out the game and win material. So yeah, this is a very common theme, but if we take a knight on d4 with a knight on f3, or something analogous, if we go from c6 to e5, this knight is still defending this bishop on e2, and this also unmasks this battery of the queen and the bishop that both hit this bishop on g4. And nothing that black tries is sufficient here. Taking the pawn this way, we're going to take back the bishop and attack the queen, so there's no time to take on c3. And any sort of check, which is going to get out of the way, can be met by knight to e2, and white is just up a clean piece here.
Yeah, really beautiful tactic. I call this one the boomerang knight trap, because in one of the major lines in these kind of ideas is if the bishop takes on e2, actually here we could even consider grabbing the queen, but normally the idea is the knight comes out, and then of course the knight comes home, completely freeing himself from any threats and with a clean extra piece. You know, one
and it
thing
draws a very nice boomerang on the board.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. One thing I have to mention, just because it is such an important coaching point to me, is not only is knight to d4 a tactical blunder, but I think it's really important to note this all could have been avoided by playing much more simple and principled chess. There are a lot of moves in this position that I have to imagine are decent. I'm interested in looking at bishop to b4, right, making a pin on this c3 knight, which is temporarily loose. I don't expect to win it, but I like to put some pressure. Knight f6 and even castle's queenside are all reasonable developing moves that do not walk into this trap.
Yeah, and I think this is just pattern recognition. One of the things that you really do get by playing a lot of games, and there's really no other way to do it, is to see these patterns, and then they'll just be part of your game and part of your calculation, and you don't have to think about it. I know that I just can see that this idea is always something to worry about, and a move like knight d4, what might look like you're adding pressure to this pin, you can see that when there's a bishop on e2, knight d4 is probably not going to work out because of this boomerang tactic.
Absolutely. Yeah, and then looking at our second to last game of the night, I would say that the dominant theme that I saw in this one was just simple board vision when the game gets complicated. We had a little bit of a strange opening. Maybe one other thing that's worth noting is that this early push of the d4 pawn is a little bit dangerous when it's not supported by its friends. I mean, something that I think is really critical here would be for black to try and play c5, right? To try and make sure that this central pawn doesn't get lost. We can see here in a moment that white is actually able to pull kind of a cool maneuver. I really liked this, right? Moving the knight back to e1 and putting pressure on this d3 pawn, which he can then follow up with queen to f3 if he even needs it. And this was a really nice way to be able to collect this pawn, which is good because if this pawn stayed, you could see how black could be on his way to a really nice game. But unfortunately, white was able to pick it up. And then quite simply, after a lot of developing and bringing out further complications, unfortunately, white made a lethal threat to the queen, which black did not pick up. So after the loss of the queen, we do have some funny business happening on this diagonal, but just not enough to be able to make up for the loss of the lady. So after a little bit of chaos and some further trades, I did like here at some point, if there was an opportunity maybe to take on b6 and get rid of this bishop altogether. But really just kind of an open and shut case, unfortunately, once the queen goes.
Yeah, and I think that's just one of the things that we see all the time. And again, we talked about how important tactics are, but as soon as you win material, you can start to trade off the pieces and just get to an end game with an extra queen. And generally, that's good for the side with the extra queen.
Yeah, absolutely. Generally. Andrew, why don't you take us into our feature event of the night and round this thing off?
Yeah, and I think this was our board one game of the week, and this really was the first time that we had two of the top players in the tournament matching up. So we had Rufus with white and Charlie with black, and we looked at Charlie's game last week in round three, and we got another hyper modern game. So this is another perk or Pierce, and I think both sides played the opening pretty well. We had our first surprise here on move 5 when black played h5, and Rufus had actually seen that Charlie played this h5 move and had prepared something against it, which was interesting. So he decided to play h3 now, and h3 is a good idea, especially when you've put a bishop on e3, because it stops this knight g4 idea, which would trade off this bishop on e3. One of the ideas of h5 is so that we can play bishop h6 and start to put some pressure on this diagonal.
Yeah, absolutely. It seemed good. Unfortunately, after another couple of moves, white receives a very nice position and a nice space advantage here. And I would say things are still looking up at this point. But this g4 break comes a little bit too early. We can see that, but partially because white has not yet finished his development,
Yes.
that he has a problem with a loose rook on h1. And black was able to take, and suddenly we realized that we don't have a good way to recapture.
Yeah, and I think at this moment, white saw the danger and came up with a pretty nice way to continue. So instead of recapturing and allowing bishop takes g4, he decided to play h4. And this is something that is very common. When you make a mistake, it's time to slow down and figure out how you can try and complicate the position and get something out of it, even if you're going to lose a pawn for nothing. So the game continued. Black consolidated his pawn advantage and developed his bishop. And again, white just decided to try and complicate the game as much as possible. So he put the knight on g5 where it eyes f7. It does keep an eye on h7. So if black does castle short, there might be some mating ideas with h5. So black decided that he didn't want anything to do with castling short, and he prepared to castle queenside. And that kind of brings us to another key moment in the game. After this queenside castling, this is a really key moment. And when we were analyzing, I did see that this castling was really a noteworthy moment in the game.
Yeah, Andrew, I remember you had kind of a grimace that came across your face immediately, saying that black is just castling into it.
Yeah, so we have this locked pawn structure, so there's really nothing that's going to happen in the center right away. So white has some time to really focus on how to checkmate the black king. This bishop is really well set up. It's going to control this a7 square. In some lines, we might try and take advantage of that by swinging the queen to the a file, and then there might be threats on a7. Obviously, none of this works right now. This is just something that you kind of have to take note of and start to prepare for later. You can see things like if we can only distract the queen from covering this a4 square, and then you find moves like knight f7 that might work someday, because if the queen recaptures, we're going to have threats like queen a4 and some threats on the a file. So that kind of lead in, we can kind of find out what the best idea for white is. So in the game, white played knight a4 to try and put some pressure on this b6 square, which would be a nice fork. But black didn't fall for that. So here, this is a key moment, and I think it's important for white to really take stock of the position and try and figure out how to break open the queen side.
Yeah, absolutely. And Andrew, at this moment, you had pointed this out to me, that it's actually with the center locked like this and so many of black's pieces relegated over to the king side, it's actually perfectly safe to come out with a move like b4 and trying for b5 to attack that structure and weaken those squares around the king.
Yeah, and b5 would have given white a very large edge and probably an attack that would have led to mate or some material win at some point. The key feature to notice when you play a move like b4 is that black has played this a6 move, and a6 is a very weakening move. So because of that, we want to attack that a6 pawn and open up either the a or the b files, and we can do that by pushing a pawn to b5, where it can either capture on a6, or if black recaptures on b5 when the pawn comes to b5, we can take back with the knight, and then we really have some threats on the a file after the a file's opened.
Absolutely. Just looking at that knight reaching in and being able to check the king and pull him even closer to the attack and other ideas like it is just absolutely terrifying. But the game instead continued with knight to a4, right? We noticed that white did have this idea of forking the king and queen with knight b6. So black very wisely steps out of that threat, right? The knight is forced to come home because b5 was a threat, and the game continued on rather still in black's favor.
Yeah, so I see that Rufus is in chat, and b4 is a hard move to play. It's definitely a scary looking move. I think the key thing that you have to notice here is that with this center locked, you have plenty of time to play b4. b4 is going to weaken this dark square diagonal, but again, the structure is locked. There's really, it's going to take forever for black to defend f7, move this knight out of the way, play f5, and then try and open up this center. So you have plenty of time to play b4, and checkmate will happen before anything bad happens on this long diagonal on the dark squares.
Absolutely. Andrew, a point that we've skipped, I've just realized from our earlier discussion, is that with the center locked like this, it probably would have been perfectly fine for black to just leave his king in the center for all these reasons we discussed, right? It's not so easy for white to be able to mount an attack here. Even as good as this knight is and the pressure with f7, right? You will have to perhaps keep some pieces at home, but I think this probably would have been a safer way to go, because the amount of space for white over here to get in and get his pieces going was just too much.
I agree. And at this moment, maybe black should consider moves like c6. Something to try and open up this c file and counterattack the white king, because the white king has committed to the queen side already and black has not committed.
Absolutely. But moving on with our game. So we had, of course, a couple of moves happen here. Right. And now we start to see the black queen side start to become active.
Yeah, exactly right. And black is going to try and make something happen before white can get an attack going on the queen side. So here, white has to respond to this threat to the bishop. He moved the bishop back to d2, and black very nicely recognized that this h-pawn is isolated and started putting pressure on the h-pawn. And now white just made a mistake. White defended the h4 pawn, but this was definitely a case where the cure was worse than the disease, and white found himself being down in exchange after knight e3.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, things were looking very tough for white at this point. I thought at this point that the game was completely wrapped up, I have to say, with black's pieces swarming in and probably just a few quick exchanges between him and victory.
Yeah, and I think white made a very practical decision that he had to get the knight to b4 so he would have some threats, and he had to do it as quickly as possible. So that's exactly what happened. And black played queen b5, hitting this rook, pinning this knight, and white decided to grab this pawn on f7 so he would have a little bit of play. And this knight on f7 actually becomes a very strong attacking piece. The two knights can really consolidate and coordinate well on c6 with this pattern of knight d8. So again, we had a couple more moves happen. Queen f1, which looks like it's forking these two pieces. And now white found this nice idea of knight c6. The knight cannot be captured, so the black king moved out of the way. And now after queen to b4, it's really time for black to take a look at the position and decide what to do. If black takes on f7, there are going to be an awful lot of threats really quickly against this king. Knight d8 is immediately a very strong move because we're forking the queen, and checkmate on b7. So it's not possible to take this knight on f7. This is one of the more instructive moments of the game, in my opinion. Black took on c6 with the pawn, and white was able to squeeze the queen into a5, threatening to take on c7, and we do have ideas of queen takes a6 if this queen moves off this diagonal. So White was able to get enough play to counteract the material deficit of an entire rook at this point, and he was able to get to a position that was probably objectively drawn. So instead of taking on c6, I think this is a moment for black to recognize that he's already up a decisive amount of material. He has an extra exchange, and this h4 pawn is terminally weak. We can kind of scoop it up at our leisure with this bishop maneuver. So the most important thing is to remove all of white's threats. And the easiest way to do that is to bring the queen back to b5. And with the queen on b5, white's going to have to do something. If he moves the queen away, well, now we can take, because all of a sudden this queen is a beautiful defender. It's covering b7, it's covering some of these c6 ideas that we looked at before. And of course, if white trades queens to keep the material, well, as we said before, black's already up a decisive amount of material. So an extra piece really doesn't become necessary in this position. It's going to be enough to have this g-pawn that races forward to make a new queen.
I have to say, Andrew, that reminds me very much of your earlier note of pattern recognition, that to me, so much of this game and the way that it ended comes down to having lost this way so many countless times before.
Yeah, you really can't get a danger sense without losing horrible games hundreds of times. And that's why I never buy expensive mice or keyboards anymore, because I do horrible things in bullet games.
Absolutely. And I have joined you in that abuse. Well, a fantastic week of chess. Some really interesting games, some really interesting ideas. And I cannot wait to see more. I'm looking forward to some of our games next week. We have another top board contention that will be released shortly. We're going to be doing pairings right after the conclusion of this show. And I think it'll be interesting to see if Aaron can continue his run of success that he's been having.
Yeah, I think the top board between Rufus and Aaron could be a really exciting show match this week. And we'll try and take a look at that in our next week's recap.
Absolutely. Until then, thank you all, those of you who are watching now, those of you who are watching on the recording, thank you for showing up. For Andrew Hoy, I'm John Harden, and this has been another episode of Acceptable Chess.